right, we are getting ready for panel number 4. We have seen the battles in their truest sense through presentations from the last 3 panels. Our 4th panel will guide you through a very different directions to finally open doors to the truth that should have been written in history. Please help me welcome the next moderator, Mr. Saul Sanders.
I think we've reached the heart of our discussion today. The panelists before us have explained how the Vietnamese Army fought valiantly and effectively with the American withdrawal. We know that the geopolitical situation was supposed to have been stabilized by the Paris agreements, and the Americans had withdrawn or were completing their withdrawal, which was the main demand of most of the participants in the negotiations. And yet the question, of course, that we have to face is, after all of this and all the sacrifices, why in the end was the Republic of Vietnam and the Americans defeated? That's really what our panel now is going to answer. We have 4 participants. I'm going to try to keep them brief as possible because I think, especially for this panel, there are probably people who want to ask questions or to make brief statements from the audience. So if we can, let's keep to about 12 minutes apiece, gentlemen. That'll leave us about 12 or 15 minutes at the end of the session. I believe that all the panelists here, with the exception, I guess, of Mr. Hosner, who's going to comment, have produced documents of what they plan to say. So if you're interested in more than they say here, you'll go to them and try to find them. Our first panelist is George J. Veith, who is the author of Codename Bright Light, The Untold Story of U.S. POW Rescue Efforts During the Vietnam War. Mr. Veith is well known for his appearances on television and his appearances before congressional committees testifying on the problem of prisoners of war. He is currently, as I understand from the notes here, completing a detailed historical analysis of the fall of South Vietnam, tentatively entitled Black April, The Defeat of South Vietnam, 1973-1975. And we'll all be looking forward to that. Please, Mr. Wright.
Well, now they've been cut down to 12 minutes, I'll let those of you who I've been harassing judge me, okay? So this means you, Jim Wilbanks, all right? So what I want to do very quickly, yeah, exactly, time, I'm done. I want to talk about 4 myths about the fall of South Vietnam. I'm going to cut through some of this because it's going to be a little lengthy, but, you know, as we know, there's been various books written about the fall of South Vietnam, and while the sort of the 30,000-foot view is well known, the events, what happened when those events are still fairly unclear. This major historical event has not undergone a really in-depth analysis, and so therefore some myths about the end of the war and about the South Vietnamese remain unchallenged. I thought I was shouting already, but all right. And really, because of that rapid collapse, 55 days, the image of the South Vietnamese as a weak army, a weak government, was really cemented in American public opinion because of that, and it became really an accepted fact among most historians. And really that happened because of the scenes from the fall of Da Nang and the retreat from the Central Highlands. We had bloody chaos, you had panic in the cities, people trying to escape any way they could, and this further cemented in American minds that the South Vietnamese was a government propped up by the Americans. So, but closer examinations of those myths lead us to contest those facts And both the North Vietnamese and to a lesser extent the South Vietnamese and the U.S. government have released a great deal of information about those last 2 years, much of it never even examined. And this indicates that what happened on the ground in Hanoi and Saigon and in Paris and in DC was far more complex than a simple collapse as a result of being a weak vassal state. So how do I know this? So the last 8 years, I've been studying the fall of South Vietnam, and through the generous contributions of my dear friend Merle Probenow, who's translated an enormous amount of stuff, we have gone through and interviewed over 15 South Vietnamese generals, over 45 other ARVN officers, translated dozens of their articles and their books. I've also gone through enormous amounts of U.S. documentation, and then even more importantly, we've gone through almost 100 communist military books, articles, divisional corps histories, and even some, for the North, for the communists, almost a treasure trove of primary source documentation of internal cables between the Politburo and their commands in the South that really show exactly what they were thinking, what their goals were. So what are those 4 myths? The first myth is the North Vietnamese did not make the decision to launch a military strike to take over the country until late 1974. The South Vietnamese military collapsed because they were weak and ineffective. Myth number 3 is U.S. aid cuts did not hurt the South Vietnamese. And lastly, ARVN put up little fight and the communists easily rolled into Saigon. I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn and how they're all wrong. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit. Most observers think that the North Vietnamese made a decision to attack South Vietnam, make a massive attack against South Vietnam after Nixon had resigned. The reality was that in the late January of '73, right after they signed the Paris Peace Accord, the Politburo made an analysis and said, listen, one or two things are going to happen. Either peace is going to break out or the war is going to resume. So we've got to prepare for both eventualities. And so what happens is that Hanoi believes that the South Vietnamese will collapse almost immediately. For years they had making propaganda that the South Vietnamese were a weak vassal state. Once the Americans left, it's an inevitable collapse. When that doesn't happen, and in fact the South Vietnamese proved to be far more resilient, they're now faced with a huge problem. So at the end of March of 1973, the Politburo meets to review the first 60 days of the Paris Peace Accord, and Le Duan begins to immediately incite the other Politburo members that the U.S. and the South Vietnamese were massively violating the accords, and he wants to return to a massive military attack as a way to win victory. As he says, he will not allow an opportunity it's taken us 20 years to create, which means getting rid of all the foreigners, to slip through his fingers. Now what's interesting about this, and we've only discovered this in the last couple of years, is that this is the first time General Giap had actually supported a military strike. Both the 68 and the 72 offensive, Giap had been against, but had only gone along because he wanted to support the majority of the Politburo. But in this instance, he actually supported Le Duan in an attempt to attack South Vietnam because he now believes his army is stronger because the Americans have all left. So I'm going to skip through some of this. And one of the reasons why that Giap is able to convince the Politburo to return to military attacks is because he's able to use an example down in the lower B2 front, down in Trung Tin province, where Le Duc An, who would eventually become the president of Vietnam, refuses to actually stop fighting and actually goes on the offensive down there in Trung Tin province. And by doing so, he holds his own territory and actually gains some. And Giap uses this example that they had been, by the PAV continuing to fight, enables them, is it the right way to go? So I'll skip through some of this. The Politburo holds a new meeting on 24 May. Giap summons all his southern commanders to Hanoi. They hold this big meeting. And even though Trung Chin and Pham Van Dong had some doubts about resuming the war, Giap, by using the example of what happened in the lower Delta, convinces the Politburo to resume preparations for a military attack. So what happens is that the Politburo has decided now to resume military offensive within 125 days of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. And nobody but the Politburo knew that. So anyways, as Giap wrote, nobody thought any longer in terms of respites. The combat, we realized, is going to drag on. It was not possible, as he said, to stop in mid-journey. And they're going to go through a period of both peace and war. Now what's very funny about all this is that while Le Duc An had claimed that the ARVN were attacking him, it was a complete lie. In fact, the PAVN were the ones attacking both through indirect fire attacks and infantry assaults throughout Trung Tin, and they had also attacked the river port of Hong Nu and the upper Delta and numerous other places across the country. And one of the interesting things that I took out from Le Duan, if you can read this, there's a little block down there, But Lê Duan said much later that our status, in terms of signing the Paris Peace Accord, our intention was to maintain the status quo and then later to proceed to attack. So the second myth, the ARVN were weak and effective, and that's why the country fell so quickly. The reality is that from January 73 until March of 75, for the most part, ARVN held their own and generally defeated PAVN attacks without massive U.S. air support. They had some losses, most of them were in smaller outposts when the PAVN had massed their forces and could attack uniformly against and drive out the South Vietnamese. And what's interesting is that by the summer of 74, the North Vietnamese, having been resupplied by massive infiltration down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, had launched extremely heavy attacks throughout the country, especially in I Corps and 3 Corps. But the key here is that they did not launch them at the same time. They launched them sequentially, and they did it deliberately so. They wanted to be able to attack, to drain the ARVN, but not draw the U.S. back in with a major assault. All right? And there was very heavy fighting in 3 Corps, the Duc Huê siege, which was smashed by General Truong Quang Coy's 3rd Armored Brigade. The Iron Triangle battle outside of Saigon was extremely heavy, and the most difficult battle of all was at Tung Duc, outside of Da Nang, which ARVN took 15,000 casualties in I Corps in 1974 alone and barely held the line. And this battle in Tung Duc is key because what it does is that the PAVN shifted the 304th Division off the Quang Tri line and all the way down into west of Da Nang and Quang Nam. And this has profound implications. Two things. First off, because the airborne stopped them and they could not retake the town, the Hanoi interprets this to mean, okay, we have rebuilt our forces. They are now good enough to fight against ARVN's best troops. And the second thing is that they have now moved a division from a more heavily defended area in the north to a much more lightly defended area in the south, and were successful at it. And this gives them the idea for Ban Me Tuot in 1975. So they now drop plans to attack simultaneously and countrywide. And so going into the second myth about the ARVN, the ARVN was a perfect army, but it wasn't the weak and cowardly one portrayed by the U.S. media. And I put an example here that, for example, at the very end of 1975, I give the Rangers as an example. Out of 17 Ranger groups and 51 Ranger battalions, 68 senior officers, not one single commander deserted his troops, despite all the images of guys running away. Same thing, you count the Airborne as the Marines. Out of 100 officers, if you count the Airborne and Marine battalion and regimental and battalion commanders, only 3 officers actually left. Most men stayed with their troops and faced years in prison. So the South Vietnamese are facing the same problem they'd always faced. The PAVN ability to mass, but with U.S. intelligence and U.S. air power and mobility, able to mitigate that advantage. The problem has always been is that South Vietnam is an extraordinarily difficult country to defend. That is the major problem. These are some examples from 1975. I want to sort of talk about, just very quickly here, give some examples of when I say that South Vietnamese did not crumble. For example, during the attack of Ban Me Tuot, the 1st Battalion of the 53rd Regiment was holding their base camp outside the city at the Phuong Duc Airfield, and they held out for a week against a multi-regimented assault supported by armor and artillery. And only 30 men out of 350 men made it back to Nha Trang when they finally decided to break out of there. Trong Tan in 3 Corps, the 31st Ranger Group defended for several days against multiple tank-led assaults by the 9th Division. The 9th was so badly battered it was pulled out of the line for a month and couldn't do anything, had to be resupplied. What I think is one of the most amazing battles that no one knows about in the 75 offensive is that 2 regiments of the 22nd Division, which were clear up at Bin Cay, defending against the 3rd Division coming in, had to make a 20-mile fighting retreat, breaking through 3 roadblocks to get back to the beach when they were ordered to retreat. And even the communists admit that that was a pretty amazing thing. And then the last example is down in Can Tho, the 21st Division, which at that time was considered the worst one in ARVN, beat back attacks by MR9 and so badly beat them up that they postponed any further attacks until the very end. Third cut, and third myth, and I'm going as fast as I can here. The 8 cuts distinctly hurt the South Vietnamese, not only in what happened to them on the ground, because in some ways the JGS cut back their fuel and ammo to the point where they're trying to hold supplies, but the impact on morale was just as devastating. And so, for example, they reduced their HE to only 4 rounds of M105 per day, 2 rounds of 155, 2 grenades per man per week, 80 rounds. Fuel was so tight, they would have been out of gas by July. And one of the things that I always sort of talk about, and this one right here, is that they had to, in the 4th Corps, during the height of the offensive in March, they were out of sorties. They had to actually go into their April supply for fuel to actually supply their helicopters and airplanes to go attack. And then lastly, something I was talking to John Prowse about earlier was that economic aid was just as bad, those cutbacks, because, for example, a survey done of General Hinn's 3rd Division conducted in '73 discovered that 90% of the families had only eaten meat once during the month. So it was a combination of those economic cutbacks and the military cutbacks that really put the South Vietnamese on a precipice. Lastly, I want to talk about the Battle for Saigon, which very few people know about because most Americans were trying to get out at that time. But in that second bullet point here, from 5 to 30 April, the PAVN lost 3,500 dead and 8,000 wounded. Now, the bulk of that is at Sun Lap. But actually, the bulk of that is not at Sun Lap. That's there before that. I'm sorry, no, it was at Sun Lap. Town of Honai, which is the next big town after Sun Lap towards the Saigon on Route 1. The PAVN 4th Corps was unable to advance until the Marines actually retreated. And then one of the really nasty battles happened at the Army School, and the 304th Division took 400 dead trying to capture it, and didn't capture it until the Army were ordered to retreat behind the Dong Nai River. And the 3rd or 4th Division commander said the fighting was incredibly ferocious. Our troops fought the enemy's troops, went there for every inch of ground, and whenever we pushed forward 200 meters, they would push us back. And then this is, I think, also interesting at Tan Son Nhut, which is the actual picture you see in my computer when you see. The 10th Division formed 2 massive armor columns, the 2 largest formed in the war. And they attacked Tan Son Nhut, and they actually got an armored column that was 2 kilometers from Tan Son Nhut Air Base on the afternoon of April 29th, and were crossing the bridge over the river, heading for the air base to take it. They didn't give a damn whether the Americans were there or not. They were heading for the air base, and the only reason it was stopped was the bridge collapsed under one of the tanks, and the column had to back up and go back out on Route 1. And they finally joined back up, and they made it into Tan Son Nhut. The airborne, the Lohi, who had escaped from Central Highlands, and the 81st Airborne Division were waiting for him in ambush, and just, it was a pretty nasty battle. And then I comment about this, and it says, and this is a quote taken from the Deputy Commander of the PAVN 2nd Corps, because people will say, well, the North Vietnamese had taken Saigon without breaking a light bulb. That was sort of a phrase where people said because they had taken the city without really having any fighting. Most of the fighting was on the outside. But General Wang Dan, the Deputy Commander, said, back then I told people if anyone says that we attacked and captured Saigon without breaking a single light bulb, I will give him a shovel and help him dig the graves of our dead. During our attack, our 2 Corps lost over 400 men, so I wonder how people can write such things, even the North of Vietnam, and that's rare to see. A few final notes. As I mentioned, the 10th Division's deep penetration attack against Tan Son Nhut consisted of the largest armored attack in the war, with 65 vehicles broken into 2 columns, roughly balancing the armor on both sides. They had a regiment of infantry on each column. They had an anti-tank battalion, an engineer battalion, sappers who went ahead of the column to grab the bridges, and then they ran these armor columns right at guys. As I said, they were going for Tan Son Nhut, and they would have taken it with the Americans there or not. And then last thing I always think is kind of interesting, the number of North Vietnamese troops, or I should say PAVN troops in South Vietnam at the start of the Ho Chi Minh campaign was 587,000. That's about 270,000 alone in the attack on Saigon against less than 90,000 if you count everybody on the South Vietnamese side. It was a massive army that they had managed to acquire, and I talk about it in that book. So anyways, thank you very much for your time.
That was a long 12 minutes, but okay. Our next panelist is going to speak on the really critical factor, and that is intelligence and the Paris Peace Accords. Colonel Hoang Ngoc Lang was drafted into the military in 1951 and went to the Nam Dinh Military Academy, served in combat units in his early service years, and was promoted to captain.
To the armed forces and will attempt to illustrate how the balance of power shifted following the signing of the Paris Agreement. Because of the importance of this topic, I will be speaking in my native language of Vietnamese. Professor Big will translate to ensure that there are no misunderstandings due to language differences. Trước nhất, tôi xin nói về hòa đàm Ba Lê. Trong hòa đàm Ba Lê, Cộng sản Việt Nam đã có ưu thế, trong khi hội đàm qua các mật đàm song phương với Hoa Kỳ, nên đã biết trước được cái thỏa hiệp Ba Lê như thế nào, và cái ngày ký kết đầu tiên đã dự định là ngày 27 tháng 10 năm 1972.
Yes. We, learn about the Paris first draft of the Paris Agreement in October of 1972, in which the American side made concessions to the communists. Yeah.
Vào đầu tháng 10 năm 1972, Cộng sản ở miền Nam Việt Nam đã bắt đầu học tập Hiệp định Ba Lê ngay ở cấp huyện.
In October 1972 already, the communist sides have already learning, the details of the Paris Agreement.
Vì biết trước ngày hòa đàm, cho nên Cộng sản đã dự trù một kế hoạch. Kế hoạch đó là chiếm đất giành dân và định lật đổ chính quyền Việt Nam Cộng Hòa ngay trong ngày đầu tiên của Hiệp định Ba Lê.
Because they had that information before our side, so therefore they already go through many learning sessions going after land grabbing and population grabbing operations.
Chiến dịch chiếm đất giành dân này đã không thành công cho Cộng sản.
That their operations did not succeed.
Sau ngưng bắn, Cộng sản đã khẩn trương mở các chiến dịch tổng tấn công tiếp vận và di chuyển nhiều chiến cụ mới vào trong miền Nam Việt Nam.
While they were doing all of that, they also transported a lot of equipment and materials into South Vietnam.
Chỉ một tháng sau ngày ngưng bắn, tại Khe Xanh đã xuất hiện nhiều vị trí hỏa tiễn SAM-2 tối tân của Nga, tương đương với hỏa tiễn Nike của Hoa Kỳ.
Yeah, only a couple of months after Khe Xanh, they already introduced many of the SA anti-aircraft rockets. Yeah.
Tôi có một số slide trình chiếu với quý vị. Trước nhất đây là các súng phòng không thông thường và bậc trung là 30,50 ly ở trên màn ảnh.
What you see up there are the kind of anti-aircraft equipment that they have been able to bring into South Vietnam together with their SA missiles.
Đây là cái loại súng phòng không cao cấp hơn, 37 và 57 ly qua radar hướng dẫn.
These are the kind of anti-aircraft equipment that you can see there with 37 millimeters, I think. Yeah.
Đây là hỏa tiễn tầm nhiệt SA-7 do Nga Xô chế tạo, cá nhân điều khiển, được phát giác ngày 7 tháng 4 1973 khi hai trực thăng của Ủy ban Quốc tế Kiểm soát đã bị Cộng sản bắn ở quốc lộ 9 Quảng Trị.
Yeah. This is the heat-seeking SA-7 produced by the Russians that were discovered as early as April the 7th in 1974.
Slide kế tiếp.
The next slide.
Là các loại cơ giới thiết giáp.
These are armored kind of tanks and other armor carriers.
Các loại đại bác 120 ly và 130 ly không có ở trong slide.
120 and 130 millimeters cannons that we don't have slides for.
Muốn mang tất cả những các chiến cụ xâm nhập vào Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, Cộng sản phải lưu tâm tới cái vấn đề tu bổ và bành trướng thêm đường xâm nhập. Đây là cái đường xâm nhập trong thời chiến tranh gọi là đường mòn Hồ Chí Minh.
Yeah. In order to bring all that equipment into South Vietnam, they have to use what is, during the time is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Sau Hiệp định Ba Lê, Cộng sản mở thêm và hoàn tất vào cuối năm 1973 một hành lang xâm nhập mới trên lãnh thổ miền Nam gọi là hành lang Trường Sơn hay là hành lang 14.
Yeah. At the end of 1973, they already built a second line, and which is called the Ho Chi Minh Corridor, which is inside South Vietnam, as opposed to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was in Laos and Cambodia.
Hành lang này dài 900 cây số. Hành lang này kéo dài 900 cây số.
Yeah, that's the Ho Chi Minh Corridor that goes inside it.
Với sự tu bổ và bành trướng các hành lang, các đoàn xâm nhập xe cộ từ nay trở đi được nhận không ảnh khám phá ra từ 200 đến 300 chiếc có thể di chuyển suốt ngày đêm 24 giờ trên 24 giờ.
With the creation of this corridor, then the aerial photography revealed that they could have convoys of 200 to 300 how do you call it, trucks bringing all these equipment down to South Vietnam at all times.
Lúc đầu, các chuyển vận còn được che giấu, ngụy trang trong các nhà kho, sau nhiều quá còn phải để lộ thiên ở ngoài trời một cách công khai.
At first, all these equipment was still kept in camouflage warehouse and things like that. But after a while, they brought in so much that they could not even have enough warehouse, so sometimes they keep the equipment out in the open.
Ngụy trang tỷ dụ như là xe tăng di chuyển thì có lập mái giả ở trên mái xe tăng để ở trên trời nhìn xuống tưởng là một mái nhà chứ không phải là xe tăng.
At first, their tanks were camouflaged with the how to call it, the haze roof, so that you think that they are people's homes, but they are not tanks.
Đặc điểm của sự xâm nhập lúc bây giờ là vận chuyển bằng xe vận tải. Các đoàn xâm nhập có thể sử dụng xe vận tải di chuyển vào miền Nam, không phải đi bộ như trước.
So with all these mechanized transportation, they didn't have to walk down the trail as they used to.
Do đó, thời gian di chuyển đã cắt giảm. Thí dụ đi từ Vinh ở ngoài miền Bắc vào lãnh thổ quân khu 3 Việt Nam Cộng Hòa đã giảm từ 100 ngày xuống còn 25 ngày.
And that's why, in moving from a place like Vinh in southern part of North Vietnam into the Third Corps, it used to take 100 days, but now with all this mechanized transportation, it took them only 25 days.
Các xe tăng và thiết giáp trọng pháo cũng theo đường này để được vận chuyển vào miền Nam.
The tank and armor personnel carrier and all these guys also follow this same route into South Vietnam.
Thiết giáp PT-76 được sử dụng lần đầu tiên trong cuộc tấn công ở Kiến Đức, Quảng Đức quân khu 2 vào đầu tháng 12 năm 1973. Trận tấn công này kết hợp với pháo binh 122 ly và 130 ly.
So some of these heavy tanks were first engaged into the fighting as late as 1972, yeah, as early as 1972.
Để cung ứng đầy đủ nhiên liệu cho các sự chuyển vận của xe cộ trên hành lang xâm nhập, 2 hệ thống ống dẫn dầu đã được thiết trí.
In order to have enough petroleum to go with all this motorized movement, then they established two, how do you call it? Yeah, the pipelines, yeah, two pipelines.
Hệ thống đầu từ quân khu 1 đến tỉnh Quảng Nam, hệ thống thứ hai từ Hạ Lào xuống địa phận Quảng Đức.
The first one from the Region 1 down to the second corps, and the second one from Lower Laos into Quảng Đức.
Các toán viễn thám của Việt Nam đã được thả xuống khu vực Nam Quốc lộ 14 của Công Tum và Pleiku để kiểm soát, chụp hình, kiểm chứng.
And South Vietnamese reconnaissance have found these things down in places like Pleiku, so as to know how this thing is going on. Yeah.
Hệ thống ống dẫn dầu này có đủ máy bơm và bồn chứa.
These pipelines have all the equipment that is needed, including pumping stations and so on. Yeah.
Bây giờ tôi xin nói tổng quát về lực lượng Cộng sản vào cuối năm 1974.
I'd like to give the general situation of the communist sides at the end of 1974.
Tháng 7 năm 1974, khi Cộng sản tấn công vào Nông Sơn và các vị trí quân sự ở Thường Đức, Quế Sơn, Quảng Nam, cuộc tổng tấn công đã phô bày cho thấy Chiến trường bây giờ đã chuyển sang là chiến trường quy ước và có cơ giới hóa.
So when the attacks happens in Nông Sơn and Thường Đức, then it shows clearly a very, very conventional warfare.
Tấn công giữa ban ngày, có xe tăng và đại bác hỗ trợ.
These attacks happen during the daytime and with support by tanks and artillery.
Ngay cả súng phòng không loại bom 7 ly cũng được phối trí trên đồi cao trực xạ vào các mục tiêu quân sự của Việt Nam Cộng Hòa.
And even the 37mm anti-aircraft things are positioned now on even the high hills inside Vietnam. Yeah.
Đạn pháo binh được bắn thả dài.
They have an unlimited supply of cannonballs and artillery. Yeah.
Trong khi chiến trận tiếp diễn, quân tiếp viện được di chuyển tới bằng quân xa tới khu tập trung. Quân tiếp viện, trong khi chiến trận đương tiếp diễn, quân tiếp viện thì đã được chuyển đến bằng quân xa tới khu tập trung để tấn công.
So even as the battle was going on, the reinforcement were also brought in through mechanical in trucks rather than the difficulty that they had before. Yeah.
Tháng 10 năm 1974, các sư đoàn tổng trừ bị của Bắc Việt trước kia bị tổn thất nặng nề trong các cuộc tấn công 72, nay đã được tái bổ sung, tái trang bị, tái huấn luyện.
So by 1974, the General Reserves divisions and units of the North Vietnamese have been refurbished so that they recover from the situation in 1972.
Và đã nhận được lệnh tái xâm nhập vào nội địa lãnh thổ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa.
And they received the order to reinfiltrate into the south.
Tại miền cao nguyên Pleiku và Kon Tum đã có thêm 4 sư đoàn của Cộng sản.
There's up to 4 divisions in the Kon Tum Pleiku areas.
Tháng 10 năm 1974, nghị quyết Trung ương của Đảng Cộng sản nhận định là lực lượng quân sự của chúng đã mạnh hơn bao giờ hết từ trước tới nay.
In October of 1974, one of their resolutions says that their armies is at top strength ever, at the highest ever level.
Cộng sản dự tính đến việc tấn công các đô thị lớn như Sài Gòn, Huế, Đà Nẵng, Cần Thơ.
They can think now of attacking large cities like Saigon, Huế, Da Nang, Cần Thơ.
Và quan niệm nếu chiếm được các đô thị lớn thì các tỉnh nhỏ sẽ bị mất theo.
And the idea was that if they attacked the big cities, then the small towns and cities would just fall as a result of that.
Bây giờ tôi xin nói về quân đội Việt Nam Cộng Hòa cũng ở trong thời kỳ cuối năm 1974.
Now I'd like to speak about the situation of the South Vietnamese Army since the end of 1974.
Ở vào thời điểm 1972, lực lượng quân sự của Việt Nam, của Hoa Kỳ và của các quốc gia đồng minh tham chiến tại Việt Nam có tổng số là 22 sư đoàn.
At the time when in 1972, the total effective of the Vietnamese, Americans and allies was 22 divisions.
Sau hiệp định Ba Lê chỉ còn 13 sư đoàn bộ binh Việt Nam, trong khi đó nhiệm vụ phòng thủ lãnh thổ miền Nam vẫn như cũ.
After the Paris agreements, that whole responsibility of 22 divisions before now falls on just 13 South Vietnamese divisions, and with the same territorial responsibility.
Quân viện của Hoa Kỳ bị cắt giảm tối đa, cho nên đã có những cái hậu quả như sau.
And the military aid from the United States have gone down drastically with the following consequences.
Kế hoạch gia tăng lực lượng tổng trừ bị không được chấp thuận.
The plan to beef up the general reserves of South Vietnam was not accepted.
Quân số giảm 100.000 người, chỉ còn lại 996.000 người.
From over 1 million people, there's only 926,000 left.
Không quân Việt Nam phải cắt giảm hoạt động của 10 không đoàn, khoảng 200 phi cơ đủ loại.
And the Vietnamese Air Force also was reduced.
Các hoạt động hải quân giảm 50% hoạt động, sông ngoài chỉ còn 28%.
The Vietnamese Navy also operations also came down to only 50%, with the river operations down to 28%.
Hải quân Việt Nam phải giảm 600 giang thuyền.
And the Vietnamese Navy lost 600 river boats.
Pháo binh Việt Nam bị bắn hạn chế đạn, chỉ còn 6 viên ngày cho Đại Bắc 105 và 4 viên ngày cho Đại Bắc 155.
The Vietnamese artillery forces were also left with 6 bullets a day.
Nhiên liệu hành quân cung cấp cho các sư đoàn bị giảm, chỉ còn là 1/4 so với năm 72.
And the fuel that is available is down to 1/4 of what we had in 1972.
Quân xa bị giảm sút 55% vì thiếu nhiên liệu và thiếu phụ tùng.
Army trucks and things like that were also drastically down because of this lack of fuel.
Kết luận, vào cuối năm 1974, tương quan lực lượng giữa đôi bên, ưu thế đã nghiêng về phía Cộng quân vì chi viện của khối Cộng Nga, Xô và Trung Cộng đã tăng gấp đôi so với chi viện năm 1972.
And the logistics, of course, also suffered tremendously because the other side, the military aid to the communist side from the Soviet Union and China doubled.
Cộng quân đã hơn quân đội Việt Nam Cộng Hòa về chiến xa, về Đại Bác, về vũ khí phòng công, về hỏa lực pháo kích, về đạn dược, về tiếp liệu tồn trữ, về lực lượng tổng chuẩn bị. Quân đội Việt Nam Cộng Hòa về chiến xa, về Đại Bác, về vũ khí phòng công, về hỏa lực pháo kích, về đạn dược, về tiếp liệu tồn trữ, về lực lượng tổng chuẩn bị.
In all of these areas that I've just reviewed, then the balance is drastically shifted.
Ước tính cuối năm của Phòng 2 Tổng tham mưu là quân sẽ tổng tấn công vào năm 1975, sớm nhất là vào mùa khô ở cao nguyên Quân khu 2, bắt đầu vào tháng 3 1975.
At the end of 1972, the General Staff already predict general offensive in early 1975.
Và ước tính là Quân khu 2 sẽ là chiến trường chính, điểm là Ban Mê Thuột và Pleiku là diện.
And according to our prediction, the second corps would be the main area of operations, with Pleiku and Kontum being the main targets.
While I was only able to give a brief overview of the enemy and friendly postures after the ceasefire, I hope that I gave you some insight into how the balance of power shifted following the signing of Paris Agreement. The information that I share with you today was the result of most of the intelligence gathered not only on the Vietnamese side, but also in coordination with the US military DAO. Finally, I would like to remember and honor then Vietnamese officers, intelligence officers, who took their own life after the loss of the war. This concludes my presentation. I would like to thank you all for your attendance and attention.
Thank you, Colonel Hong. I see that Bui Diem in this official biography has finally admitted that he's older than I am. And I suspect that means that he's going to trot out the argument of being older brother for the not infrequent arguments we've had over the last 60 years. Bui Diem graduated with degrees in mathematics from the University of Hanoi. That means that he escaped being a communist from the medical school. A member of the South Vietnamese delegation to the 1954 Geneva Conference, which of course established the, quote, neutrality of Laos. He later became Minister at the Prime Minister's office in 1965, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, 1966, Ambassador to the United States, and Special Envoy at the Paris Peace Talks from 1966 to 72. It only took them 6 years to produce a totally false document, by the way. He's the author of The Jaws of History, recognized as one of the most important of the inside descriptions of U.S. and Vietnamese relations. He's president and executive director, of the Pacific Basic Research Institute, which did a fabulous study of the Vietnamese economy some 20 years ago, never given publicity here, but circulated by the Politburo. Jim.
Thank you, Saul, for your brief introduction. I know that it is a very long day for all of us already, so I try to be brief, as brief as I can be. But it is going to be very difficult, and so, well, I hope that you are going to be patient with me a little bit. But I will try, I promise you that, because I know that, well, it is a long day. Now, with the presentation already made by my colleagues, I think that you have already a fairly good idea about the preparation of the two protagonists of the war, Hanoi and Saigon, between 73 and 75. On one side, we can see clearly the fierce determination of Hanoi to go ahead with his plan to mount a general offensive against the South, the Paris Accord notwithstanding. And they were very encouraged by the Soviet Union, and they were massively supplied by Communist China. On the other side, my side, Saigon was on a defensive mood, not knowing exactly to what extent we can rely on foreign aid, while the US, already tired to the extreme by the war and paralyzed by the messy Watergate scandal, the US seemed ready, almost at all costs, to find a way out of the morass in Southeast Asia, ignoring completely the sacrifices of more than 58,000 Americans who died in the war, and even when it was only a matter of a few hundreds of dollars for South Vietnam. I tried to complete the picture here above described by my colleagues by simply adding a few recollections of mine about the experiences not so encouraging that I had to endure between 73 and 75 when I served as a kind of troubleshooter between Saigon and Washington. When I was in my permanent post in Washington, my work was comparatively easy. In spite of the state attack, the policy of support of the war was more or less accepted by the public opinion. And in the same time, the US troops were still in Vietnam. 500,000 of US troops in Vietnam. And above all, the Vietnamization program begins to have some kind of promise, a promise for a solution for the American to gradually withdraw the troops from Vietnam. But unfortunately, these favorable circumstances didn't last long. In fact, many of my congressional friends, Democrats and Republicans, among them I have to mention particularly the late Congressman Clemens Zaberkley, the two late Senators Aiken and Tower, who helped me a lot with their analysis of the mood of the Congress. They warned me as early as 71 that the cost of the war started to be a serious factor in the debate for foreign aid in Washington, and that as a matter of consequences, even at the normal level, aid to Vietnam should not be taken for granted, even in 71. Now, December 72, I have resigned from my post at the middle of 72, and I was enjoying my status a private citizen in Saigon when President Thieu called me back in service again and sent me to Washington. My mission then was to try to improve the draft of the Paris Agreement. Dr. Kissinger came to Saigon in October 72, and he presented to President Thieu a draft of the Paris Agreement. President Thieu was not happy about the Paris Agreement, and my friend Hoàng Đức Nhã somewhere around here can attest to me to that. And so I went to Washington, but by the time I arrived in Washington, my preoccupation was in terms of how to improve the draft of the Paris Agreement. But very quickly, I found out that it was too late already. There is no way to improve the draft of the Paris Agreement by then. President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger had decided that somehow they have to come to a conclusion with Hanoi. I quoted exactly the word from Dr. Kissinger when I met with him on January 5 in Washington. Quote, unquote, President Nixon and myself, we had decided in cold blood that it is essential to reach an agreement now because it would provide a new basis for the continuation of aid to South Vietnam. That is the proper words of Dr. Kissinger. A few days later, 4 days later, it seemed to me, I met with General Haig, and General Haig said to me like that, quoted and unquoted, President Nixon has no more flexibility. I have no doubt about his determination to proceed in case there is an acceptable agreement with Hanoi. He will call publicly on President Nixon to join him, and if President Thieu rejects it, then that it would mean the abandonment of Vietnam. Very precise words in what Haig told me by then. Well, my friends, my paper has for title, The Search for Aid After the Paris Agreement. But in fact, the problem, the issue of aid to Vietnam was a burning issue even before the Paris Agreement was signed. South Vietnam by then, in January 73, faced two unpalatable alternatives. accepted the agreement the way it had been negotiated already, with only a vague promise, an uncertain promise of US aid, but along with it, the very heavy risk of war later with the North Vietnamese troops inside its own territory, or to refuse the agreement and face the completed cut-off of US aid to Vietnam. Again, I quote here the proper words of Dr. Kissinger in a meeting with me in Paris on January 12, 1973. He said, quote, "Your overwhelming and urgent requirement for the time being is a continuing US support. We will come soon to the moment of truth. You either concluded the agreement with us or be cut off from US assistance." That is what Henry Kissinger told me on January 12 in Paris, just a few days before he signed the Paris Agreement with the other side. Well, Saigon had no choice, of course, between the two evils. Saigon chose the lesser one, and the Paris Agreement was signed. The world rejoiced at the good news. Washington prepared to welcome back the prisoners of war. Saigon tried to figure out how to cope with the new situation, while Hanoi celebrated their self-proclaimed victory with preparation to regroup their forces for another showdown. I don't know whether we can call it decent interval, quote unquote decent interval. But in the aftermath of the signing of the Paris Agreement, there was a real relaxed atmosphere all around in Washington. With the American soldiers home already and the prisoners of war soon to be released, America seemed to be in a new mood, no longer obsessed by Vietnam. And then President Nixon invited President Thieu to come to the state at San Clemente for a stated visit. President Thieu attached a good importance to the meeting in Washington, in San Clemente, because he considered it as a good opportunity to go face to face to what extent he could rely, he could count on the American president. So with the visit scheduled for April 3rd, he asked me again in mid-March to return to the US to prepare the ground for the summit meeting and assess the new situation in Washington. Laying the groundwork for the presidential visit, I got back in touch with my Washington circle, senators, congressmen, the whole news media group. Sniffing the new Paris post-Paris New Air, I realized right away some remarkable differences. The oppressive political atmosphere that anyone could feel in January, it was gone. Vietnam as an issue was already a thing of the past. Nobody talked about Vietnam at that time, after January 1953. Asked to add to Vietnam, if you ask the opinion of the congressional staff people up in the Hill, the consensus was definitely it could not be like in the previous year when US troops were still in Vietnam. Hopefully, it could be maintained at some reasonable level. I went back to my old friends in the Congress and all the supporters of the cause of Vietnam, Senator Javits, Senator Tower, Senator Aiken, all of them, from them, I asked the question, is it true, like Dr. Kissinger told me, that after the signing of the Paris Agreement, it would be a new atmosphere and it would be a new basis for the aid to Vietnam? Their sympathy to Vietnam notwithstanding, all of them said to me that since all the US troops are back already, and with new development around the world, it is quite difficult to predict the situation. President Thieu went to the summit meeting at San Clemente with a lot of expectation. Perhaps he didn't get all he had in mind, but he came away from the discussions with President Nixon in very good spirits. He got assurances of strong retaliatory action if North Vietnam violates the signed agreement, and he received promises of economic and military support. Now, I quoted the proper order of President Nixon again. Quote, "You can count on us," unquote. There was the exact word of President Nixon during the meeting at San Clemente. But nobody on our side at this point in time knew that even as he hosted the Vietnamese delegation, the national leader at the height of his power, just re-elected to a second term in the landslide victory, he was struggling in the midst of a developing scandal. A scandal that 1.5 years later forced him to resign. Everyone on the side of the Vietnamese delegation, in the contrary, believed that with the assurance from our allies, one way or the other, aid to Vietnam would continue, and the Vietnamese delegation, including President Thieu, will return to Saigon with warm feelings. The real awakening about aid, okay. Well, I don't know how to shorten it, but I try to do my best, and just in the middle of the thing. So it is 2 pages more, so okay? The real awakening about aid came in the fall of '73. Not counting the developments in the Middle East, the oil embargo, the increasing embarrassment for the Nixon administration, and all the trip back to Washington in October. I have to make it, making a plea for military supplies. I found myself in a situation where literally there is not a single person to talk to in Washington in the corridor of power. Not a single person. In fact, that Washington was in shock. Vice President Agnew had resigned for alleged corruption. Attorney General Richardson had quit over the firing of Special Prosecutor Attorney General Richardson. As to the request from the administration for aid to Vietnam, from 2.1 billion, it was down to almost half of it. The package of aid to South Vietnam of 1.1 billion still will be cut down to 700 million by the Congress in its appropriation process. And adding to that, the Defense Department, with its fiscal procedures, reduced even more the amount, practically leaving 400 million for South Vietnam. And it was, at that time, the world fuel and the commodity price went up. It looked like the US Congress was doing what we could do to shut down military and economic aid to South Vietnam. The situation at the end of '73 was depressing enough already, but it came worse with a deepening political crisis involving President Nixon, and when, in November, Congress overrode the Nixon veto and passed the War Power Act, limiting the power of the president. By March 1974, the talks in Washington were about the impending impeachment of President Nixon. Precisely at this time, again, on the way back from a kind of diplomatic tour in Europe and in Japan, I returned to Washington. All I could do at this time was to take note of the debilitating atmosphere in Washington and the kind of lack of interest of all the political circle in Washington about Vietnam, and especially about aid to Vietnam. I have many friends on the Democratic side, like Senator Jackson, Senator Stennis, who support the war before. But by the time it came to the problem of aid to Vietnam, they kept their distance. We got a kind of consolation prize. Vice President Gerald Ford accepted to see us. But what could a vice president in this atmosphere in Washington, what could the president could do? Nothing. So, well, we consider that it is a kind of consolation prize, but really a small consolation prize. The situation quickly developed in Vietnam. It deteriorated around the end of '74. On the military front, it became clear that Hanoi was preparing a new offensive. The Politburo views the Nixon resignation as an unmistakable indication that the US could not come back to Vietnam, and they started right away their probing offensive by attacking the provincial capital of Phuoc Long in January. There was no reaction at all from the American side. So they went ahead and attacked the Ban Me Thuot, a strategic provincial capital in the Central Highland. The city fell on March 11, then on March 15. President Thieu called me again, and he talked about my new mission to Washington to lobby for an emergency aid of $700 million. I had a meeting with him, but he didn't mention at all his decision to order the withdrawal from Pleiku and Canton. But when I took the plane to go to Washington, at the time I arrived in Paris, the whole thing collapsed. On March 22, I arrived in Washington and learned immediately about the disastrous retreat. But this tragedy turned the $700 million in urgency fund, the object of my trip, from an urgent necessity into a matter of life or death. The continued existence of my country was now to play out its final act in the whole of the US Congress. The day I arrived in Washington, where the old imperial capital was cut off, in Washington, Congress adjourned for a 10-day recess. Henry Kissinger was away engaged in the Middle East diplomacy. President Ford had gone on vacation to Vail, Colorado, skiing in Vail, Colorado. That day I met with an old friend of mine, Phil Habib, at the State Department. He's an old friend of mine, and he's very blonde. He said to me, quote, unquote, "The president is tied down by the War Power Act. I don't know how we can get through to the congressman. We have to impress the congressman with the emergency, but he had really his hand tied." That is the word from Habib. And when I came to the office of an old friend of mine, Senator Aiken, he told me, "The outlook is black. On March 30th, Da Nang was overwhelmed by a force of 35,000 North Vietnamese troops. But a momentary light glowed when President Ford sent Army Chief of Staff VALIANT to Vietnam, along with CIA Far East Chief Ted Shackley. I went to see General VALIANT on April 9 when he returned from Vietnam. Although he was very pessimistic, he told me that the South Vietnamese still had a chance to regroup and hold if military assistance could be delivered in time. Personally, General VALIANT, he said, he would support the immediate passage of the 8th bill. Unfortunately, the gleam of hope at his packet died 2 days later when on April 11, the bill up in the Congress was defeated. Cut off from communication with my government, with nothing more to do in Washington, holders of power, my role was finished. I took the plane back to Saigon, empty hands, a few days later. All my political experience taught me not just what was about to happen, but to understand it, to appreciate the viewpoints of the lawmakers. And so I did. But deep in my heart, I knew that the essential question had nothing to do with American credibility or the unfitness of the Saigon leaders. The essential question in my mind at this point in time was the kind of life that millions of South Vietnamese would have to endure once this Congress had made its choice. The life and lives of their children and of their children's children, that was the real issue. But in 1975, that was not an issue that could move the American legislature. And I could not help but rage at the unfairness of it. And inside my temporary little home in Washington, I couldn't keep myself from weeping. All in all, it is a sad story. But sad as it was, it has to be told for now and for the future generation. But that is the purpose of this conference, and thank you.
That's what happens when Mrs. Bui lets him stay up all night and work instead of putting him to bed early. We have one more panelist. Dr. Hausner is going to comment on what's been said. Dr. Stephen Hausner is a senior staff member of the RAND Corporation, where he specializes in research in U.S. involvement in post-World War II conflicts. Among other books, he's the author of The Fall of South Vietnam, Statements of Vietnamese Military and Civilian Leaders. Dr. Hausner.
Thank you. I know we're pressed for time, and what I think I will do is to offer a context for the remarks that we've heard this afternoon, and add what I think is an important strategic perception to the situation faced by the South Vietnamese Armed Forces after the Paris Peace Accords. I'm going to cover 4 points. The first is that South Vietnam was forced to adopt a defensive strategy. It had to protect the population and territory, but it lacked the capability to cut the enemy LOCs, what Colonel Lung proceeded to describe so ably in the Ho Chi Minh West and Ho Chi Minh East. They couldn't attack the North, and they couldn't force compliance with the Paris Peace Accords. That was the U.S. responsibility, and one that the political situation in the United States prevented President Nixon from doing. As a consequence of this, Hanoi and its forces always had the initiative. And the defensive strategy was burdened by a policy on the part of the South Vietnamese government and President Thieu, 4 no's, is to defend all territory. So the armed forces had the duty to defend an area with a country with 1,700 kilometers of borders, in which the enemy had lodgements all along, major depots, base areas, et cetera. And in addition, because of the whole question of defensive strategy and the inability to attack Hanoi, they could send their entire army south with no fear of an amphibious Inchon kind of invasion or cross-border invasion on the part of South Vietnamese forces. And because Thieu had the policy of 4 no's, the South Vietnamese military had an enormous challenge, and they lacked the resources to meet this. They didn't have the capability to defend this entire territory. They lacked divisions. They were short of divisions. General Trung told me that in I Corps he needed at least 2 to 3 more divisions to hold I Corps. In II Corps they needed 2 more divisions, but in particular they needed mobile reserve divisions. The airborne and the Marines, which we've heard about today, are fantastic fighters, were tied down in I Corps in static positions defending I Corps. You also had Ranger groups who were very good, but there was no substitute for having more of a reserve. And they lacked the strategic lift to move their forces around. During the '72 offensive, Americans did a lot of American aircraft did a lot of lifting of South Vietnamese forces and resupply. But by the time of the Paris Accords, the South Vietnamese were reduced to a squadron of C-130As, which were the hardest planes to maintain, and they only could keep, 5, 8, 9, something like that, flying at any one time. Another key point is that the South Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese Air Force lacked the aerial firepower that might have enabled a sustained defense. This is a tremendously important point when you look at the kind of air which was employed throughout the war, and when particularly that was employed in the Easter Offensive, against the Easter Offensive. The South Vietnamese VNAF was equipped with what has to be termed low-performance aircraft, A-37s, the F-5 Freedom Fighter, nice aircraft, but no comparison to the F-4s, not to speak of the B-52s in terms of carrying capability and striking capability. In addition, they faced, the South Vietnamese Air Force, faced a much more hostile air defense than was the case in 72. And it was nothing like the benign air defense picture that existed at the time of the Tet offensive. There were no less than 23 anti-aircraft regiments, enemy anti-aircraft regiments in South Vietnam, equipped with radar-controlled anti-aircraft, quad 4s, proliferation of SA-7s, the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. And they had one SAM regiment with SA-2s up in the northern part of South Vietnam. The Vietnamese Air Force had no electronic countermeasure equipment, so their aircraft could not function in these high defense areas. As a result, you had enemy sanctuaries within South Vietnam, which were no-fly zones as a result of these heavy air defenses, which could not be penetrated by South Vietnamese aircraft, and where the enemy was able to stage, prepare, and launch their forces. The helicopters were extremely vulnerable to ground fire, and their lift capability was compromised. And this was the aircraft that the South Vietnamese had most of, 800, 900 helicopters, but they were very vulnerable in this. And the South Vietnamese Air Force had a reduced capability to provide close air support to ground forces because of this. They lacked airborne forward air controllers who could operate. They'd get shot out of the sky. And they had to fly at high altitude, about 10,000 feet more, while bombing. This led to great inaccuracy and a lot of fratricide when they hit, during the attack on Ba Ma Thuột, the forward headquarters of the 23rd Division was holding out in Ba Ma Thuột, and VNAF aircraft came in to give them air support, and they dropped bombs and they hit the forward division headquarters, and that ended that defense. This very brittle posture that the South Vietnamese Armed Forces had required, at the minimum, in order to be effective, outstanding command and control, planning, and first-rate decision-making on the part of the commanders. And unfortunately, this was not the case. I won't go into all of them, just let me talk about the decision-making. The decision, President Thieu's decision to reposition defensive forces in South Vietnam, which was made around the 10th of March, just the time this offensive was kicking off, was made at the worst time possible. It is one of the most difficult military maneuvers to withdraw while your forces are engaged. Very few teams can do it. The decision to withdraw from Pleiku along Route 7B was a disaster, and the decision to move the airborne out of I Corps unhinged the defense of I Corps. And it's those moves that unhinged the defense of South Vietnam you could not defend. And given these realities, a successful defense of South Vietnam, I think, was problematic at best. And I think we must salute those South Vietnamese soldiers and airmen who fought courageously under these and other daunting circumstances that existed in the spring of 1975. And they deserve our recognition and admiration. Thank you.